Welcome to another episode of the Hakam Inspire podcast. Our guest today is Professor Sohail Husain, who is a professor of pediatrics and chief of the Division of Pediatric Gastroenterology at Stanford University. He's a physician scientist whose lab focuses on determining areas related to the pancreas. Professor Husain has authored over 100 scientific papers, 12 book chapters, and has filed several patents related to pancreatic disorders. He serves as past chair of the North American Pediatric GI Society's Pancreas Committee and Research Committee, and a councilor of the American Pancreatic Association. Professor Husain also serves as the president of the Association of Ahmadiyya Muslim Scientists USA. His most recent research paper, published in Science Translational Medicine, reveals a novel, unexpected discovery that might compel you to eat your carrots more often. It's been widely picked up by various news outlets, and we'll get into more information about this. But first of all, Professor Husain, welcome to the Al-Hakam Inspire podcast.
Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you, and thank you for the invitation. It's great to be here.
Professor Husain, I just want to dive right in. A huge question, and I guess it's an undertone feeling, is that science and religion, it doesn't go together. And there's many scientists, doctors, researchers who are vocal about their atheism. And we've got prominent scientists who say God doesn't exist, science and religion are completely opposed, it's an oxymoron, it doesn't go hand in hand. But of course, you're a Muslim, you head the Science Association of Muslim scientists in America for the Ahmadiyya Muslim Community. What's your take on this? What's your view on this? And how have you seen religion, of obviously Islam, coupled with your scientific endeavors and research?
Father, the only reason I'm here today in my role, I believe, is because of my faith. If it were not my faith that motivated me towards being curious, wanting to understand the world around me, and wanting to help others in my situation with respect to solving medical problems, I could be doing perhaps a host of other things that would not wish to move the needle. And so it is my faith that actually allows me to think the way I do. And because of my faith, I believe that I have had the chance to reach the level of scientific understanding that I have. It's also very personal. And if I might just share that when I was a college student many years ago, over 30 years ago right now, I had this sort of debate in my head about science and religion. I was not an Ahmadi Muslim. I belonged to another Muslim group, and I was a biologist, a pre-medical undergraduate student whose major was biology, and I was struck by the conflict between evangelical Christians, and especially in the U.S., but also in Britain and elsewhere,
Right.
and evolutionists, Darwinians, who, on the one hand, believe that everything arose by evolutionary change and by chance. There was sort of an instant of time in which things moved and then they just kept moving in a random manner, versus evangelicals who thought that everything happened just 6,000 years ago, and they're all lumped together. And I was unsure of who to accept, because both seemed somewhat far-fetched. And what I recognized, and this was by the grace of God, the moment for me to actually embrace the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. I had read an article by the second caliph of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community about evolution. And in this article, and it was in a magazine called The Review of Religions, I believe. In this article, the second caliph explained how Islam, and through references, accepted that life evolved and that biology evolved in general, and that organic molecules evolved, and that the evangelical version of the creation of life could not have, is just not plausible, could not have existed. And then on the other hand, he also wrote that things did not happen by chance. And I further read excerpts from the founder of the Ahmadiyya Muslim Community, and they're also all based on the Holy Quran, the Book of the Muslims.
Right.
And in this passage, the promised Messiah, the founder of the Ahmadiyya Muslim Community, Hazrat Mirza Ghulam Ahmad of Qadian, peace be upon him, meets a professor from some other country who comes to visit him in his hometown of Qadian, and they have a conversation about evolution and and creationism. And the promised Messiah states that we don't believe in creationism because the Quran is pretty clear that Adam was the successor of someone else. When it says that we have appointed Adam as a Khalifa or a successor. And what I recognized was that religion and science had to be one and the same because God was the creator of life and the world around us. And he was also the writer of the holy books and the sender of these prophets. So for me, it was actually a journey towards accepting the Ahmadiyya Muslim community and what I believe is the true Islam through this question.
No, that's great. I think the professor who you're referring to is Professor Clement Wragge, who was he was a British scientist, meteorologist, and he came and it's interesting because in that conversation was actually the last guest who the promised Messiah Hazrat Mirza Ghulam Ahmad alayhi salam met in Qadian, and Professor Wragge said to him that all intellectual people believe, and people who study the world, that science and religion don't go together. But after this conversation with you, you've joined them together. And the promised Messiah, peace be upon him, actually said that's part of my mission, to show people that science and religion do go together. So it's really interesting. You say that. I guess just a quick question. If you said your faith tells you to ponder, could you go a bit deeper into that? How because I think a lot of people don't realize how many injunctions there are in the Holy Quran where God says reflect, so on and so forth. How have you drawn inspiration from that?
Oh, indirectly and directly.
Right.
So indirectly, there are hundreds of verses of the Holy Quran, which when you read them, and I encourage everyone to read them, it tells you to ponder, as you mentioned, to ponder while you're sitting, standing, or even lying on your side. In fact, I'm almost tempted to lie on my side right now because it's morning time in California.
Of course.
But in whatever posture you are, to really think deeply about why you exist, why other things exist around you, and how you can put it all together, and what that grand purpose is. And I think one of the big needs in science is purpose. We do a lot of things that are characterizations, where we just want to understand without a particular hypothesis in mind. And the UK is a great example because of initiatives like the UK Biobank, where 500,000 healthy individuals from the UK are being tracked just for their health. But there should be a purpose, and the purpose is to understand human beings in that case. And so the Quran, number one, gives us purpose.
Right.
We want to understand what the Creator has created so that we can understand Him. And it says multiple ways. If you only knew, if you only thought about this, why don't you think about this? And
Yeah.
the Holy Quran leaves no stone unturned, in my view, in trying to stimulate someone from, figuratively getting off their chair, but also directly. And I think there are multiple passages in the Quran which allude to potential discoveries. And I ponder over them frequently, and I wish I could uncover them. But this is where I think the more you ponder over those particular segments, it gets more interesting. Shall I give you one example?
Yeah, no, sure.
Absolutely.
Of course.
Yeah.
Well, so the Holy Quran states that, and perhaps if one of you has the reference, is that that milk is pure, labanan khalisan, and then but at the same time, it's pure, but it's between feces and blood. It's sort of
Right.
opposed to two other fluids that, if contaminated, could cause problems. And so the scientist should also always ask the straightforward question as well as the converse question. So what keeps milk pure is one question. I mean, it's one of the most fascinating aspects of nutrition, which is honey, milk. There are certain fluids in nature which, by their very sort of biological pathways of formation, are free of infection, of problems once they're made. Um, and but then the second question is, well, why is that mentioned? Why are blood and feces mentioned? Why are two relatively, or quote unquote, impure or potentially contaminating fluids mentioned? And I think there's probably a really interesting purpose. And only about 2 decades ago did we recognize that we've got an entire set of organisms that make up more cells than the cells of our body in the feces that we harbor, and that is called the microbiome. And you wonder whether the microbiome contributes to the composition of milk that is quote unquote pure. And obviously you got to read into the lexicon and understand the meaning in its context as well as how it's used elsewhere. But I think there's probably a discovery just waiting to happen between milk, the microbiome, and circulating metabolites in the blood from the microbiome. But those are the kinds of, I would say, direct inferences that scientists can make as Muslims.
No, that's wonderful. And just as a quick reference, that's from Surah An-Nahl, the bees. And of course, that's a whole discussion in itself. And that is chapter 16, verse 67. So our listeners and viewers can go and ponder over this verse as Professor Sohail Husain has guided us. So that's super interesting. Thanks for that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we want to get into kind of your recent research, talk about the pancreas, but just very quickly, off the back of the discussion and points you were mentioning, I think it's a fascinating example that you've given. But we've had guests on the podcast, ophthalmologists, neurosurgeons, psychiatrists, all talking about the same thing, that the Quran has been a source of knowledge for them, has provided them with guidance. In your, I mean, you've authored over 100 scientific papers and you've got a breadth of research background. In your opinion, how important do you think it is for Muslims to, study the Quran and research the verses of the Quran and look at the commentary of those verses to gain an understanding?
I can tell you what we're sort of advised by the leader of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community to do. And I think if I was to summarize it very figuratively, and this is paraphrasing many of His Holiness's comments, Hazrat Mirza Masroor Ahmad, the fifth caliph of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community's comments, it's the difference between night and day. If you are not using the Holy Quran as Ahmadi Muslims, and if you are using the Holy Quran as Ahmadi Muslims, it will be like night and day in the sense that our progress is tied to studying this holy book. And in 2013, if I might just share a brief history about the U.S. Ahmadi Muslim scientists. In 2013, we had our first Holy Quran and Science Symposium, which is now, by the grace of God, an annual event. And in that first meeting, His Holiness sent a lengthy letter, 2-page letter, to the participants of the meeting. And in this letter, His Holiness said that the early Muslims who led the first golden age of Islam flourished because they studied the Quran, they studied its inspiration. And when you read about many of these scientists, in fact, I just happen to have the book about one of the greatest ones, Ibn Sina or Avicenna.
Yeah.
You realize that alongside the science, he was actually writing commentary on the Quran. And when he had a problem, he'd run to the mosque, or he'd do some other things like drink a lot of coffee and try to stay awake. But here was sort of turning to the faith and specifically the Quran from what His Holiness mentioned. But then the Muslims declined, and today, unfortunately, they're nowhere to be seen as leaders overall in the scientific field because, according to this holiness, they left the Quran or left the study of the Quran. And our holiness has told us that it's up to us as Ahmadi Muslims to lead the next golden age of science and technology, the next Islamic golden age of science and technology, through picking that book up again and studying it.
Absolutely. No, that's fascinating. And I think it's, you have the next Ahmadi Muslim Scientists Conference in a few weeks' time. So I've always enjoyed personally watching Muslim researchers and scientists talk about their research into various aspects of the Holy Quran. Just getting into kind of the topic at hand and a little bit about your current research, just for our listeners to kind of break things down and bring in the kind of introduction. What is the pancreas? What is pancreatitis, and how does the pancreas function in terms of its endocrine and exocrine function? What does it do to the human body?
You're asking for a whole lecture, Dr. Hakam.
Yeah,
Let me see if I can break it down into the basics. The pancreas.
that'd be great.
The pancreas is the most interesting organ of the body. Number one, it is behind the stomach, and the ancient Greeks thought that it was just a cushion for the stomach. It was only until this last millennium that it was recognized that the pancreas does two major functions. You alluded to each of them. One is that it makes insulin, and that is essential for maintaining blood levels. And without insulin, you develop diabetes. And so that's one of the primary functions of the pancreas. The second is that it produces as a factory more than any other gland of the body enzymes that it secretes into the intestines, and these are digestive enzymes, and they are necessary for digestion of a meal, including fats, carbohydrates, and proteins. And so that's the exocrine function of the pancreas. It turns out that the endocrine function, that diabetes saving portion that makes insulin, is only about 2% of the pancreas mass, whereas a little over 90% belongs to the exocrine. And so the two of them live together harmoniously in one organ. And that's also of interest. I mean, why is that? In fact, there's probably a really important discovery to be made based on the juxtaposition of two essential functions in the body. The problem, though, which is what I study primarily, is that sometimes the pancreas can act up. Its digestive enzymes can digest itself. And this auto-digestion leads to one of the most painful diseases known to people called pancreatitis. Pancreatitis is an inflammatory disease of the pancreas, and it's not uncommon. In fact, in the US alone, nearly 400,000 people develop pancreatitis every year. And some of them develop chronic pancreatitis, which is a debilitating disease that causes people to lose their lives from intractable pain. And a fraction of them can go on to develop chronic pancreatitis. They can develop diabetes. There's an increased risk of pancreatic cancer. So my interests are to solve the problem of pancreatitis.
So you mentioned diabetes. Obviously, 2023, there's all kinds of epidemics, diseases. One of the huge discussion points, especially in the health and fitness sphere, is all about type 2 diabetes, controlling your insulin levels. We hear insulin resistance a lot and even insulin sensitivity. So if you could explain about insulin resistance, why it's developed, especially in our modern, hyper consumption era, and what can people do? Because especially, type 2 diabetes, so many people develop it, and everyone's talking about exercise and nutrition. But from your, years and years of research, what would you? So, first of all, if you could explain what insulin resistance is, and also insulin sensitivity, and we hear that it's good, but why is it good? And then how we can address just daily habits, avoiding type 2 diabetes.
It's an important question that needs to start early. Unfortunately, most of us think about a problem when the problem starts. For a problem like diabetes, it's important to consider prevention as you're young, so in your youth, and similarly for heart disease. And in diabetes, what happens is there are two types of diabetes. In the first type, that's less common, people lose their insulin secreting cells. And we think that that's an autoimmune phenomenon, that the body somehow creates antibodies or other immune targets against those insulin producing cells. And that's called type 1 diabetes. And that happens early on in life, and you're insulin dependent, and that too, is something that perhaps we can't necessarily prevent, but there's a lot of intensive work to understand what the triggers are and how to prevent those triggers. The more common type of diabetes that occurs in perhaps over 80 to 85, 90% of people is the type 2 diabetes that you're alluding to, which is where the pancreas is not necessarily the problem. The pancreas is still making insulin, and it's the target tissues that are no longer able to receive the insulin as well. And that resistance to insulin it has many factors, the biggest of which is obesity and a sedentary lifestyle. But that starts early, so you can reverse many things once you realize you've got a problem. And how many friends do you know who were 50 pounds overweight and then recognized that they needed to lose weight after their blood sugars went up and they developed type 2 diabetes? But the real solution, I think, is to start early. It just so happens I'm also a pediatrician, and I wanted to put in that plug because what you do early on in life will help you much more than what you can do later.
And what are those things that people can do?
Exercise is definitely one of them. Eating in moderation. All the principles that are mentioned in the Quran. I used to write as a columnist when I lived in New Haven, Connecticut. I live in California now, but when I was on the East Coast of the U.S., and I wrote this article on what I called, quote unquote, the Muhammad diet. And it was just a healthy eating as well as healthy living. And there were quotes from the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, as well as quotes from the Quran. But what I also mentioned was that this is kind of what virtually every faith recommends.
That's fantastic. And I think diabetes in itself is very interesting because it affects not just the developed world or the Western world, but also the underdeveloped world as well. And there's this huge variation into whether our diets have a role to play in the increase of risk factors for developing diabetes. I just wanted to kind of get into your recent research, which has been very interesting and picked up by a lot of media as well, in terms of detailing vitamin A and retinoids and how carrots may be useful in protecting this pancreas, the wonderful organ that you've described, and preventing pancreatitis. So tell us a little bit about that and how you came about doing that research as well.
Certainly, this is one of the most fascinating areas that our laboratory has recently discovered, and we're very grateful for those discoveries, which were based on a screen. It was unexpected, and it led us to this common theme that we're talking about, which is food is medicine. We started with milk, talked a little bit about honey, or had a sliver of honey, and then we migrated to food in moderation. Well, there are two types of foods generally. One are the macronutrients, the ones that provide calories, fat, carbohydrates, and proteins. And then there are the micronutrients, the ones that you only need a little bit of, but some of them are essential and you can't get them except through the diet. And those are the vitamins or vitamins if in the UK. And so among these vitamins is a vitamin called vitamin A, which is a fat-soluble vitamin. You need it through the diet. And the way you get it is either through eating meat, and in that case, already formed vitamin A is absorbed into the body, or you eat plants and fruits and vegetables. And in that case, preformed vitamin A is enzymatically converted through a series of pathways into the active forms of vitamin A that circulate through your body. And it was known for several decades, and I had the great privilege of meeting the epidemiologist who was a former dean of the School of Public Health, a Lasker awardee, which is a big deal in the United States, and who had put vitamin A on the map to solve the problem in the developing world of blindness. So we think about vitamin A in the eyes, that it's necessary for development and function of the eye. And then he was able to show that it was important for maternal health. And so now the WHO, the World Health Organization, recommends vitamin A in both scenarios across the board. And it's dirt cheap, and it's really saved millions of people
Wow.
and helped them see better or see properly, as well as avoid death due to pregnancy and birth. Well, vitamin A is also known to help in the lungs, in the skin. If you've ever had acne as a teenager, you took vitamin A in the form of retin-A or other similar types of medicines, and in that case, you applied a pea-sized amount, right? And so vitamin A has been known for a few organs, but it was never fully understood in the pancreas. We knew that that on the one hand, the pancreas was responsible for the absorption of vitamin A, and that we knew. But we didn't understand whether vitamin A affected the pancreas. And that's what our research showed, which was, I believe, a very large discovery, and that requires now an open door to many more investigations. What we found, and I'll give you the nutshell of what we found. We found that when you looked at the FDA Adverse Events Database, the Food and Drug Administration of the United States database for pancreatitis cases due to a specific anti-leukemia drug. The drug isn't important in this case. It's just that this was a means for us to latch onto a very specific form of pancreatitis. When patients were taking this drug and they reported developing pancreatitis, we asked what other drugs were being given, and this was in conjunction with several other bioinformatics collaborators around the country. And what our lab found, and with these collaborators, was that those who took vitamin A serendipitously, right? So inadvertently, just happened to be taking vitamin A, were protected against pancreatitis.
Wow.
Right.
And then we went to electronic health records, and we saw the same phenomenon as we were drilling down into the details. And it happened not only with vitamin A taken by mouth, but also vitamin A that was applied on the skin. And then we did a series of experiments in mice, because mice aren't exactly people, but they can help us understand biology and disease. And there are models of pancreatitis in mice, and we're able to show that when you take the pancreas cells from mice and you culture them, we can reverse some of the inflammatory gene programs by giving vitamin A. And then we also did some fancy, what are called in silico techniques, where we asked what would happen in a scenario where we had pancreatic inflammation and upregulation of those genes, and what are the compounds that would bring down that gene upregulation. It turned out that among the largest hits were the vitamin A analogs. So all of this as a systems approach led us to this new discovery of the role of vitamin A, this micronutrient that you might have just thought about for the eyes and for maybe a couple other organs, to be potentially very important to preventing inflammation in the pancreas.
Wow. And carrots, they have a lot of vitamin A?
Yes, the pigment in carrots, beta carotene, is the source of making more vitamin A. There are other sources. There are other pigments such as beta-cryptoxanthine and so on in other fruits and vegetables. But carrots probably stand out. And then you should know, if you're a vegetarian, forgive me, but that the largest source of vitamin A is actually liver. So if you're going to a fancy restaurant and you want to get a heavy dose, order the liver.
Yeah. And eating liver and consuming it, it's a massive thing in the health and fitness sphere these days as well. But yeah, thank you, Professor Husain. It's been wonderful speaking to you. We know, extremely busy. You're running a lab. You're doing all sorts of research, wonderful research. It's been, amazing speaking to you, especially going deep into the pancreas, understanding it a bit better, the diseases, how to treat them, and of course, science and religion. That was beautiful as well. So yeah, thank you very much. We really appreciate that.
It's a pleasure, and I wish you the best.
Jazakallah. Thank you so much, Professor Hussain. I think it was a fantastic discussion, particularly what we wanted to inspire and encourage other people to research the Quran further. Myself, one of the episodes that I presented, so about 2017, I presented a research looking at embryology in the Holy Quran and the process described. And then we presented it further on the podcast as well. It was really kind of using the Tafsir Kabir as well to understand and correlate with Professor Keith Moore, who's a Christian professor, looked into embryology as well. So it's very fascinating for me on a personal level and faith inspiring. So I feel like whichever field you're in, when you start looking into the Quran, we've had archaeologists on, cosmologists, when you look into the Holy Quran, it really kind of merges that aspect of science and religion, allowing it to go hand in hand.
For sure. May I leave you with one parting thought?
Yeah.
Khalifatul Masih, the fifth Khalifa, His Holiness, is quoted to have said in a historic address to the Ahmadiyya Muslim Research Association of the UK in 2019, quote, "When they," meaning believers, "pray to Allah for guidance, He grants them clarity of thought. He enlightens their minds, and washes away the haze of incomprehension that previously existed." And I tell students of science that you have to have purpose, and purpose turns you into a curious mind, right? So you want to learn. But the next phase is clarity. And life is complex. Biology is complex. Everything around us is complex. To have clarity about the questions that you want to ask, and then to be able to express how you would go about asking those questions. That level of clarity, most people don't go through that second phase, but that's what turns you into a topic expert. And that requires prayers, that requires conviction. And then it's that third phase, which is the acquisition of data. So purpose, clarity, and data. The acquisition of data, the performance of experiments, or the accumulation of new data and new knowledge is what turns you from a topic expert into the world leader of a field or the creator of new fields. And so as Ahmadi scientists, and as scientists who are Muslims, or as scientists in general, and science doesn't belong to any religion, we should always think about those words that I quoted from His Holiness, which is, let's try to gain clarity, remove that haze of incomprehension that exists for so many things. It's like cracking that code and then testing it. So purpose, clarity, and then data.
That's wonderful.
It's wonderful.
Fantastic.
Thank you for listening to the Al-Hakam Inspire podcast. We hope you enjoyed it. Visit our socials on Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube at Al-Hakam Inspire. And of course, subscribe to our YouTube channel and leave your comments there. We would love to hear your feedback and thoughts, so send us an email to inspire@alhakam.org.